It is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the NOVA Center on Business, Human Rights, and the Environment to this webinar episode. My name is Susu Jabula. I am a research assistant at the NOVA Center on Business, Human Rights, and the Environment, a law student at NOVA School of Law, and the regional director of HeForShe Lisbon, a global solidarity movement to promote gender equality. Before we begin, I'd like to inform you all that this panel is being recorded and the recording will be made available in the upcoming days. This webinar episode will focus on corporate due diligence and gender equality. When it comes to gender inequality, we must address the root causes of this phenomenon, without disregarding the contributions of individuals and corporations for gender inequality. To truly create a better and more equal world, being a gender equality advocate asks of us to be against all forms of discrimination, such as racial or sexual orientation-based discrimination, among others. In the midst of the social and economical recovery, we must not leave the gender equality issue behind, given the proven impact gender roles and expectations have on our daily lives. In order to truly achieve a more equal society, we must be inclusive and make sure that all women, all men, and non-binary people are equally protected. And we must also be intersectional. Intersectionality acknowledges that everyone has their own specific experiences of discrimination and oppression, and we must consider everything and anything that can marginalize people. This means that, for example, experiences of Black women, migrant women, or from women in white-collar jobs will differ, and understanding these intersections will help create better policies. This is the 6th and last episode of our webinar series on business, human rights, and the environment in Europe, connecting the dots. This series would have not been made possible without the support of the Portuguese Presidency of the Council of the European Union and a number of partners, including the Portuguese Ombudsman Office, which is the Provedor de Justiça, the British Institute of International and Comparative Law, Teaching Business and Human Rights Forum, and NOVA for the Global. I would also like to acknowledge Claire Bright, the director of NOVA BHRE and the convener of this webinar series, and thank all of our distinguished guests, as well as the team behind the scenes. This means Laura. It is now my pleasure to introduce our chair, Teresa Anjinho, Deputy Ombudsperson of Portugal since December 2017. Teresa Anjinho was a Member of Parliament, Secretary of State for Justice of the 20th Constitutional Government, Deputy of the Municipal Assembly of Coimbra, and member of the Commission for Equality and Against Racial Discrimination. She has dedicated her academic and professional life to the study, to the teaching and advocacy of human rights, with an important emphasis on women's rights and the right to equality and non-discrimination. Ms. Anjinho is a graduate of law of the University of Coimbra and holds a Master in Human Rights and Democratization of the University of Padua, Italy. Teresa, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Now the floor is yours.
I thank you, Dusu, very much for the words. And hello, everyone. First of all, let me begin by thanking the organizers, in particular to the NOVA School and Claire Bright, for leading the way in the creation of speech, particularly in Portugal, around business and human rights, which is very, very important. Give a warm welcome to all of our panelists and extend greetings, of course, to all participants in this meeting. The Ombudsperson Office in Portugal, along with many other NHRIs nationally, Europeanly, at European level, international level, has been following quite closely the issue of business and human rights. And let me say so that this is happening not just because we recognize the growing importance of private companies in essential domains of life, like health, social sector, also public essential services, not only because of that, and of course, recognizing the impact that they have, not only in terms of the exercise of human rights, but how they are violated, but also because more and more we are receiving complaints related to business and human rights, from the so-called modern slavery cases, namely seasonable working, agriculture particularly, to abandoned quarries resulting from the construction of dams, to exploitation lithium, and even the access to services related to digital transition. And what is becoming more and more real to us is that we have huge governance gaps that we have to tackle, particularly at the level of awareness. And this is important because with awareness comes a lack of participation, and with a lack of participation comes a very important lack of trust. So if we recognize the importance of companies also in terms of development and the fulfillment of the SDGs, if we want to profit from what it is positive, we really have to address what it is negative, the look at the dark side. And this is actually what the agenda of the UNGPs give us, is this look. And we're doing so not only because it is the right thing to do, and this is very important, but because it is the smart thing to do. It's a win-win. We're not only putting people and the planet in the center of the speech, we are also putting these same companies, because we are creating a new business culture, more resilient and also more competitive. So I have no doubts, a bottom-up movement that is led by the people, like climate change, and we're not going to go away. So when it comes to mitigation of risks, I do believe, after my Star Wars moment saying that we have to look at the dark side, allow me for a James Bond moment and say that it's a question of adapt or die moment. So let us now hear, we are going to talk today about corporate due diligence and gender equality, exactly to discuss the future that we want. And what an honor and an incredible challenge it is for me, being moderated of such a highly qualified and brilliant panel. I'm sure that you are going to be fascinated about what you're going to hear, and probably also become pioneers of this agenda. Starting with Penelope Simons. So you are Associate Professor and Vice Dean of the Research at the University of Ottawa, and you have been engaged for over a decade in research on corporate human rights accountability, publishing widely in this field, including a wonderful book, I have to say, you co-authored, entitled The Governance Gap, Extractive Industries, Human Rights and the Home State Advantage, where you focus on the importance of home state regulation. Penelope, why is it important to talk about gender equality as a business and human rights issue? Thank you very much. You have to unmute.
Penelope, you unmute yourself.
Mute
Thank
and
you.
unmute. Praise of the year.
After a year, you'd think I know how to do that. Okay, so I'll start again. Thank you very much, Teresa, and thank you, Claire, for organizing this panel, inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure to be amongst such an incredible group of experts. And I'm going to say a few things today that draw on some of my work with co-authors Melissa Handel and Sarah Seck. So why is it important to talk about gender equality as a business and human rights issue? Well, first of all, just let me say that, of course, gender equality, as was mentioned before, is a broader issue than women's equality, but I'm going to confine my remarks to women's equality. It's important also to note that, neither business activity itself nor its impacts on society are gender neutral. We live in a patriarchal world, and despite the apparent advancements that we have in international and domestic law, women continue to be the subject of significant discrimination and violence in their everyday lives, including in the context of business activity. And I want to look at resource extraction as an example. So first of all, it's women's relationship with resource extraction, as with any business activity, is complex and multifaceted. They can be members of boards of directors, managers, employees, lawyers representing resource extraction corporations, clerical workers, miners, human rights or environmental land defenders who oppose extractive industry, or members of communities in which resource extraction takes place. But let's look at some of the gendered impacts of resource extraction. And these have been well summarized by an academic called Katie Jenkins. And she talks about the fact that, environmental contamination of land and water supplies and the increased workload on women who may have a responsibility for sourcing food and collecting clean water is one impact. Another is the effect of toxic contamination on the health of communities and increased burdens on women who have to care or may have to care for sick family members. There may be also voluntary or involuntary displacement of communities and shifts from an agrarian economy to a cash-based economy, both of which can have an impact on gender roles. And finally, there's increased violence against women, increased risk of violence against women. And so I want to say a few words about violence against women, because sexual harassment and other violence against women are a pervasive global phenomenon, and they're widespread across all business sectors. And acts of gender-based violence in the context of business activity, of course, are linked to structural and gender equalities that manifest themselves in the subordination of women in society. Now, women's experiences of violence in the context of resource extraction, of course, differ from country to country and as between women, depending on a range of intersecting factors from race to socioeconomic status. And I know that somebody else is going to, Nadia is going to be speaking about intersectionality. But there's growing evidence that large-scale mining and resource extraction can pose significant risks of violence for women and girls. And I'm going to just quickly talk about three different places in which this occurs. The first is the workforce, the workplace, where you have this very male-dominated industry, although women are increasingly entering the workforce, and women are often employed in kind of undervalued and underpaid jobs, cleaners, cooks, housekeepers, clerical work, laundry services, but they may also be employed as minors. But it doesn't seem to matter whether they're managers or cleaners, they still face frequent sexual harassment, or they may be the victims of sexual assault. And it doesn't matter whether the mining is taking place in the global north or the global south. Reports suggest that women face daily sexual harassment, including the expectation of sex from coworkers and the risk of sexual assault. There's also increased risk of domestic violence when you have an extractive activity moving into an area because of many factors, and I won't go into them, but things like the disruption of property ownership, change in gender roles, etc. Fly in, fly out culture, and people coming home from high stress shift work and then returning home and engaging in alcohol and drug abuse. And finally, there is often violence against women in the local communities. You have often in these situations an influx of large numbers of male workers. Increased gender violence then ensues, including sexual violence against women in communities. It may also be used as an intimidation tactic by security forces against women or land or human rights defenders, or just to terrorize populations if it's in the context of conflict, or possibly to stop them engaging in artisanal mining. So just to conclude here, I just wanted to say that it's important to recognize that discrimination against women doesn't take place in a vacuum, that it's linked to the structures that subordinate and oppress women in societies. So it's a direct result of and a reflection, as Jackie True have said, of the violence and discrimination and marginalization that women face in their communities and larger societies. And it's something that all businesses and governments need to address proactively.
Very much, Penelope, very important, and actually links to what I'm going to ask to Salil, because you're addressing the structural problems behind what is sexual harassment, sexual assault, sexual gender-based violence, and discrimination in general. So, Salil, it is a pleasure to have you here with us today. You are a writer and policy advisor with extensive experience in researching corporate activities in diverse environments and applying international human rights standards to identify human rights abuses. And you have been working with all sectors and stakeholders to build accountability and advocate positive change. So the pandemic, COVID-19, has led to significant changes in the way we work. And we all know how crises are cruel magnifying lens of previous existent vulnerabilities. For example, in the Ombudsperson's office, taking good account of the characteristics of our national social landscape, where, for example, women are overrepresented in the health sector, and at the same time, they continue to bear the primary responsibility of being the family carers. We are paying particular attention to precarious work, to violence against women, mainly domestic violence. And for example, also the gender impacts related to digital transition and teleworking. So Salil, my question to you is, what direct impacts have you seen on women, and how can gender-sensitive approach be developed by companies to address the inequities, in particular women leaving work? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Teresa, and thank you for inviting me to this excellent panel. I'm going to learn a lot from all of you as we go along. I mean, I'd like to start by taking us a step backward, that, one of the assumptions that was made in the so-called white-collar work historically was that if only women had flexibility to work from where they could at the time they would, then life would be great and we will have more women joining the workforce. And then it would be wonderful because people can work when they want, they'll be able to look after the people that they are under their care, and they will be able to meet their deadlines and projects, which of course, makes the enormous assumption that all 24 hours of the day, women are going to be devoted in some way to work. And they are in any case. So let's not minimize that, even if whether or not they're being paid for work or they're not being paid for work. So I do want to recognize that distinction, which is often lost. But that was the assumption. So when, especially let's start with the teleworking and white collar work. First, I will go to the other issues you mentioned and the impact of the pandemic. But when the teleworking happened, everyone thought that it will be very simple, that people will be able to work from home. But women, A, had caregiving responsibility for the elderly at home or the sick, and certainly the children. Not every family had 4 and 5 screens, for laptops and so on. So, children wanted it for their school. Older children who are still at college wanted it for their college work. The partner, if there was a partner on the scene, wanted it for his or her work. And the woman wanted it herself. And probably there was a need for entertainment. So you're obviously talking about a universe which is smaller than the large, because everybody cannot afford 4 and 5 screens. Everybody does not have broadband internet access, and everybody does not have the money to pay for it, even if they want to. And they're competing competition on time. So that was one problem that was overlooked in this context. The other was, of course, the vulnerability that women often have in a domestic setting when they have domestic violence to face. And it's an unfortunate reality. It's a genuine reality. Companies everywhere in the world know about it. It's one of the hush topics. People don't talk about it much because talking about it lets you into the domain of societal changes, which companies feel they don't have the authority to speak about, either for cultural reasons or historical reasons, or if they're a multinational, can they really be imposing quote unquote our standards on quote unquote them? Whereas, not beating up people should be a universal standard, so it's not a question of you're talking about Western or Northern standard being imposed elsewhere. Be that as it may, we were in that situation where you had instances of domestic violence. Now, it's very easy to say that, fine, if you're domestic violence, leave the place and, live elsewhere. But is it really possible to do so? Are there homes available? Is it safe? And all those historic questions which we have always known were not even thought about. And the assumption was made that women will work from home, and if they're vulnerable, tough luck. There could have been solutions developed around it, that there could have been not office-oriented, not dense spots where women have to work, but other kinds of settings, shared workspaces and all that with sufficient social distancing norms once it was possible to step out during lockdowns and so on. But those were done by very, very few companies, and if at all, at that. So there was that part of it. The other part, of course, is that we all know that especially in the services sector, such as investment banking, stockbroking, and banking, and so on, so much of what happens in the workplace is based on networking. And once you tell women employees that stay at home, you can work from home, you cut them off that loop, which means that the opportunities that should legitimately go to them are missed because they're simply not part of the buzz. So that is another thing that happened. Now, this again, we are talking about college educated or college graduate women who are in certain ways privileged. I think Nadia is going to talk about intersectionality, and that's where this comes through. But once we move beyond that and look at what Teresa, you pointed out, right at the earliest, that you go to supermarket and at the checkout counters, it's usually women or women of color often who are working there. Or you look at hospital staff, where the nursing care, and there were so many other frontline facing, customer facing operations which were done by women. and again, who had no choice, but we all clapped for them, saying that they're essential workers, but not much was done to actually really look after what their specific needs are and how to address them. So all of that contributed to a lot of stress. There has been some study in the United States where I've seen some figures about that. I'm sure the figures are elsewhere similar, but the data is not there yet, about increases in mental illness and mental stress. And that also led to something else, which is the most tragic outcome, which consulting firms like McKinsey and others have already noted, which is attrition, that women are leaving work and not coming back. This is a statistic from about 4 or 5 months ago, so I'm sure it's an understated figure. Because I keep talking about US figures because I now live in the US and the statistics are more easily accessible here. But 3 million women have dropped out of the workforce. Now that's 3 million too many. Everybody has a right to opt out of workforce if you choose to do so. But if you're forced to do so because of circumstances beyond your ability to influence, then there is a problem. So I think companies need to look at it more carefully and not simply think of it as a glib solution, go work from home, here's your tablet, but look at the overall impact. Is it possible for the person to do so? And if not, what can be done to make it better? Does a person have large enough a home? If not, is it possible to move them elsewhere, while taking in mind all the pandemic-related protocols? And if there are people who are in the frontline facing situation, make sure that they have the protection equipment that is needed. Make sure that they are always in a situation where they are not exposed to the virus, and so on. And give the flexibility, give the leeway that is necessary for the women to stay, because one of the biggest problems, all the companies which set up targets that we want more women in our workforce, is that once they become part of the track, at some point the attrition begins, and the pipeline, as they call it, the management consultancies use the word pipeline, gets dried up. And how not to do so, and how to make sure that all the bad things that we have learned in the last year are overcome, to make sure that we make longer term sustainable changes so that this attrition goes down and so that women can do what they want. Thank you.
Very, very interesting, Salil. It's absolutely true. And having been in the side of the decision makers, many times what we have to do is to evaluate the impact, the human rights impact of what is being decided, because most of the times, well, the impact in terms of gender just goes exactly to the negative side of what we would want to happen. And let us now then turn to Nadia Bernaz. You are Associate Professor of Law at the Wageningen University in the Netherlands, where you lead the Business, Human Rights and Environment Research line. And you are also a known author of a highly recommended book named Business and Human Rights, History, Law and Policy, Bridging the Accountability Gap, where you look at how corporations and business people can be held accountable for their human rights impact through international, domestic and transnational processes. So, in your opinion, why is intersectionality and interdisciplinary approaches important in the context of gender equality? Nadia.
Thank you very much, Teresa, for your introduction, and of course to the organizers for having me today. I think I may have the easiest question of everybody, really. Why is intersectionality important? I think it's clear it's important because they are intersecting and multiple factors of discrimination. And if we focus only on one aspect, then we're definitely missing the point and missing the whole picture. I think what I find interesting is to look at how women, because this is the topic of today is gender equality, how women can be affected differently in different contexts. So one example that I find quite telling is marital status and whether women have children or not. So if you're unmarried and don't have children, in certain contexts, that actually can be a positive element, particularly, to talk about lawyers. If you're a high-flying lawyer in a Magic Circle law firm in London or New York or Hong Kong, not having children, not having care responsibilities actually is a good thing. but in different contexts, not being married, not having a family can be seen also as weird, and lead to all sorts of bias. So I think that's a really simple example, but I find it really quite telling for having seen it also anecdotally on myself and people I know. So the point being that, of course, different, and you can reproduce that example in various contexts, whether you talk about caste or religion or ethnicity or literacy or etc. So also other aspects. So I think the key message here, if you start talking about business, human rights, and gender, and how to look into gender equality in the context of business and human rights, I'll repeat what I think a lot of people have heard before, but I think it's worth repeating here, that a truly feminist agenda cannot stop at empowering white college-educated women, because not only is that not enough, but I would also argue that this is a damaging strategy, because it sends the wrong message that something is being done, when in fact these issues cannot be properly addressed by just doing that. So I think it's particularly telling. I know that the context, the seminar series, this webinar series, sorry, is sort of focused on Europe, and this is of course an event organized by a Portuguese institution. So I think this is particularly true in Europe, where I think a lot of the debate around this, certainly in the European Union, is about things like equal pay for equal work, which no one will really debate, of course, and also more women in the boardroom. These kind of sort of high-flying, white-collar push for more women in these kind of jobs, and for equal pay and more pay, etc., which of course is important. But I think it's the same in academia, by the way, more women professors, but generally these jobs will go to white women in priority. So I think it's important also in the context of, I know Portugal developing their national action plan on that. I just want to make the point that when designing a national action plan, it's not enough to think about, okay, how do we include women in those things? What is going to be the impact on women? But truly look at the intersectionality and various forms of discrimination within that, and include all sorts of women, not just the women you're comfortable with, because that's the women you most likely will encounter in the job, but migrant women. And we've heard from Salil about the impact of the pandemic on frontline workers, etc. I don't know what the situation in Portugal, but in many countries, those jobs are held also by a migrant workforce. But also women with disabilities and other forms of characteristics. I think we'll have a second round where I'll get an opportunity to talk about due diligence as such, but as an introduction to intersectional issues, that's I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Just a quick word to the audience. So if you want to use the Q&A to ask whatever you want, so profit the fact that you have these wonderful experts in front of you to do that and to ask what you want. I will be able to have the chance also to pull some of these questions to the panelists. Nadia, thank you very much. True, just a small note. We are now in the second revision of our draft of a national action plan, Portuguese national action plan. Things are going well, and well, we hope that by the end of the year we will be able finally to have our national action plan. But it's true, it's a huge challenge, and we'll have the possibility to talk about that, how to introduce this gender lens to the national action plans, particularly because the as you said, well, you didn't, but it was actually there. The add and stir processes are still very much the ones that everyone else follows. And it's very important to address not only the intersectionality, but the impact of these policies. So, and I will turn to Penelope, and I think it's well that I turn to Penelope exactly with this. So it is indeed important that at the same time as advocating gender lens, and we recognize the need for these intersectional approaches in order to understand and therefore include in policy actions how different forms of discrimination can compound across different dimensions as age or sexual orientation, migrant status. So Penelope, is the current regulatory framework, namely when it comes to the human rights due diligence, at the international level adequate to tackle issues of gender equality and intersectionality?
Thank you, Teresa. Yes, this is such an important question, and I think I also have some advice for you as you develop the Portuguese or finalize the Portuguese National Action Plan. I would say the short answer is no. If we look at the guiding principles on business and human rights, for example, and even the draft treaty, we see that the drafters of both of those documents have really taken this add and stir approach to women's human rights and interests. So it has not been mainstreamed, it has not been conceptualized, neither of them have really been conceptualized, thinking about women's rights and interests, but women's rights and interests have been added. I think the UNGPs are particularly problematic because, they're directing states to engage, to develop national action plans, and they're telling businesses to engage in human rights due diligence. And women are really treated as this marginalized group within the UNGPs. Violence against women is exceptionalized as something that happens in conflict zones. There's no real recognition that it's an aberration or linked to the oppression and inequality that women face in their daily lives. And there's no recognition of the structural nature of women's inequality in there either. And I would say that the working group on business and human rights has put out a great report on the gender dimensions of the guiding principles, and they've set out this great gender framework with gender responsive assessment, transformative gender remedies, and gender transformative measures with some helpful practical recommendations for both states and businesses. And I think that businesses should draw from that. I think that Portugal should draw from that as you're thinking about it, and don't replicate things like women's human rights as being considered additional rights that may be applicable only to some circumstances of business activities, because they're applicable all the time. The treaty's a little better, and that's thanks to the advocacy from women's groups and other advocates that it has more provisions. It actually has parts of the preamble that recognize this distinctive and disproportionate impact. It mentions the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the Beijing Platform for Action. And there is text in there that imposes an obligation on states to require businesses to undertake human rights due diligence that must integrate a gender perspective throughout the due diligence process in consultation, and this is very important, with potentially impacted women and women's organizations in order to properly identify the risks. And there's a little bit more language in there about women and women's rights, but in terms of due diligence, and I think, I just think it's really important that we need to look beyond these texts. First of all, the treaty, the future of the treaty is still uncertain, so we don't know where that's going to go. But if we're looking at the UNGPs, both businesses and states have to look beyond due diligence. Businesses, not just in developing, states, not just in developing national action plans, but when they are especially in Europe, where there's all of these states who are introducing mandatory human rights due diligence. How is that human rights due diligence conceptualized? I know that the Committee on Legal Affairs report has made recommendations to the European Commission, and they've told the European Commission that gender equality should be treated as a cross-cutting issue, and they've made reference to the Working Group on Business and Human Rights reports. So I don't think that the actual documents are sufficient. I think we need to really focus on mainstreaming and introducing specific provisions that address the inequality that women face, whether it's in your national action plan, whether it's in mandatory human rights due diligence laws, or the business procedures and practices.
Thank you, Penelope. It's really very challenging at the time, as you probably know, in Europe. The discussion going on is about the adoption of a EU framework on business and human rights. So initially, it was the idea was to have a European plan on business and human rights, and now it changed for a EU framework. And the discussion going on is exactly how we can draw in this framework. So Nadia, now to you. It is indeed very important to view rights holders as a not heterogeneous group. So does the concept of human rights due diligence accommodate for taking into consideration these different right holders and their multiple realities, in your opinion?
Yes, I mean, I definitely think that the concept of human rights due diligence can accommodate different groups. I mean, that's in a way, that's what it's for. Due diligence is, you know, what it says, it does what it says on the tin. It means identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for possible human rights impacts of corporations, and that means looking at various rights holders. So, you know, to come back to what Penelope was saying, it's clear that the UNGPs are deficient from a gender perspective, that they are indeed erasing, I think, multiple realities of experiences. But on the other hand, they do have language that, if not inclusive, at least we can read into it, I think. And certainly taking there's nothing, I would say, in the guiding principles that prevents companies from taking the human rights due diligence process seriously and actually doing it properly by engaging, by trying to address all forms of discrimination and bias. So there's certainly, I don't think, but maybe we could discuss that, but anything preventing that in the UNGP. So it's also what you do with what you have. So I think the main point I want to make on this is that the human rights due diligence is, of course, calling for mapping the possible human rights impacts of certain activities and of certain businesses, and then find ways to prevent it or identify it, preventing it, remedying it if that impact has materialized, if that risk, has materialized into actual impact. But I just want to make the point here that it's not just about how you see a problem or how you, the strategies you put in place to address an issue, but it's also about framing the problem. And I think a feminist approach to human rights due diligence is not just about finding solutions that include women, but it's also about how you frame the problem in the first place. Because, and I've seen that in a number of contexts, and I think it also comes back to what Penelope was saying about extractive industries. If you look at a mining development in certain communities, you cannot just ask yourself, well, what impact is that going to have on women? So this mine is going to bring economic development, it's going to bring money, it's going to bring, you know, more activity in the communities. Oh, but how are women going to be impacted? I think if you ask yourself from the start, what exactly is the problem I'm looking at? But from a feminist perspective, then not only will you have very different solutions to that problem, but also very different, you actually will have identified very different problems. And I think a lot of the work I see that is more, let's say, gender sensitive in that area actually takes into consideration solutions that could include women. But actually, I think the problem is beforehand. The problem is in the identification of what kind of problems we're actually talking about. So I would say, to come back to the question I was asked, that the concept of human rights due diligence can accommodate, I think, a gender perspective, but it needs to be done really from the start, and not just at, what kind of remedies can we have that will be, that will be good for women in the end, but more what problem can we identify. And on this, I'm not sure I have the opportunity to make this point, so I will take a couple of more minutes to make it. I often hear discussions on human rights due diligence about, and perhaps this was raised in the webinar series before. There's always this discussion about don't have a ticking box approach, ticking boxes approach, and checklist, and that's not the right way to do it, etc. I just want to propose perhaps a different approach to that problem. It's a criticism of human rights due diligence that I don't really understand, or let's say that I don't really agree with, in the sense that it just depends on what you put on the list and on the kind of boxes you're checking. And for many of us, I don't know about you, but for many of us, to-do lists is the way to get things done. So I just want to provide my perspective on that. It's the kind of language, to more seriously, I also think it's the kind of language that alienate a little bit, or can alienate governments and businesses who perhaps genuinely want to do something and then want to do it the way they know how to do things, which is by having lists and checking them and having a strategy to do it. Of course, if in your list says I will conduct 10 trainings a year on human rights issues, and that's the list, and then you just do it irrespective of quality or of whether there's a gender dimension to that training, then of course it's a bit useless and mechanical, and in the end perhaps will have very little impact. But if it's done properly, and if actually you undergo proper training with proper gender equality specialists, I don't know you, but I've learned a lot in those kind of trainings, also in different contexts. So I would like to believe that can make a difference in the long run. So it's a plea for checklists that are not that bad, and I think can help gender equality in the long run.
Very well, Nadia. It's absolutely true. My checklist also requires a lot of work for what I have to do during the day. So I believe that the criticism is right to the point. I mean, when people talk about the ticking box exercise, it's more the question of being mechanical, of course. But I do believe, and just let me tell you that. In adopting the National Action Plan, one of the things that we discussed, and it's very interesting, is the language. The language, I mean, language should be relatable to companies, Companies should understand what they are being asked to comply with. And I'm just saying that because of the due diligence translation to Portuguese, because, well, we are seeing many documents being translated in a language that, well, companies or even legal offices don't relate to in Portugal. And we should bear that in mind because, well, when we translate legislation, they have to be understood exactly to be applied. Otherwise, we will have, kind of window dressing with legislation. And we don't want that. We want an agenda for action and not, again, mere rhetorics. And this also, well, is related to what Nadia was saying. So, and now let's hear Erika's perspective on this interesting topic. So Erika George is the director of the Tanner Humanities Center and professor of law at the University of Utah. And her recently published book, Incorporating Rights, examines strategies to advance corporate accountability. So Erika, corporate social responsibility and sustainability rhetoric have changed over time to incorporate rights. That is very clear in your book. what is the role of gender activism, and in which ways can activists help improve business culture in relation to diversity and gender equality, that is, be the agents of change? Erika. Erika, I don't know if you're talking, but we don't hear you.
Hi, I was on mute even after you were teaching. I'm still on mute. I was asking if the slide that I'm sharing can be seen. It should show images of different women.
Yes.
Yeah, we can see them, yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. So listening to Penelope and Nadia, and thank you, Teresa and Claire, for inviting me. I've been thinking about women activists and women's labor rights activists who preceded this entire conversation about business and human rights and paved the way for the women in the C-suites that Nadia talked about, that has been the center of what some of our conversation has focused on when we think about gender equity and equality. So I wanted to take us back and look at early organizing, early activism. I'm speaking from the context of the United States, where clearly intersectionality had a significant influence on who was doing the labor organizing. If we look at who the women are who are doing the kinds of work that place a woman at risk, women in factories, women on farms. Initially, I wanted to start with a woman who was very active in creating labor policy for the United States. The first woman that you see with the American flag behind her is Frances Perkins, and she was the Department of Labor Secretary under the government of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, who was our president during World War II, whose wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was instrumental in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It would not have been foreign to them to appreciate how poor working conditions were, largely for migrant women. Frances Perkins was influenced by the industrial disaster of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, where women, textile workers, were burned alive because management locked them into the factories so they could continue to produce and produce. That really was a window into giving way to a major labor rights reform on the backs of women workers. There were pockets of women who still continued to be unprotected. They were largely migrant women and Black women, women who were descended from formerly enslaved people. The image of the woman with the megaphone is Dolores Huerta, who is still alive and still doing labor organizing, but she helped to organize farm workers in California, forming one of the largest agricultural labor unions. And she started as a teacher who was observing what was happening to the children of farm workers. She also saw what was happening to women in the fields in terms of sexual harassment, sexual violence. So her positionality as a migrant woman of color in the role of being in factory farms or with growers who were going to feed factories gave her a perspective that a top-down due diligence lens might not have. So to Nadia's point and Penelope's point that nothing is gender neutral, including the global policies, if we start from the perspective of women workers, I think we look very differently. The middle image is a woman that is little known, but did a tremendous amount of work. Belma Hopkins was an organizer in North Carolina who was employed by the R.J. Reynolds tobacco factory. So intersecting with growers and women in factories, and as a woman of color excluded from unions that were racially segregated, did a tremendous amount of work to stage walkouts and strikes, leading over 10,000 people, and ultimately establishing the right to organize labor. Both of these women were also active in voting rights movements in the United States. So understanding participating in governance, whether it's participating as labor organized in your firm or in the government that's going to regulate the firms that you work in, critically important. The last woman is Grace Lee Boggs. She was a Chinese descended woman who became active in labor organizing when she married a Detroit factory worker in the automobile sector and founded Detroit Summer, noticing that the people of Detroit didn't have the same resources as people elsewhere. So acknowledging the intersectionalities of different isms, racism, sexism, inequality, poverty, and demanding better wages and creating space for people to have these conversations. Now, my last figure needs no introduction, perhaps, And I included Sheryl Sandberg because of her work trying to include women. We can disagree about whether it's leaning in and should be on women to insert themselves in these places. I would suggest that we need to look at why these places are difficult for women to enter. So throughout the value chain, whether we're at the top of the corporate structure or at the very bottom, inequality exists and persists for women. Shoshana Zoborov, who's a scholar whose work I very much admire, has called Sheryl Sandberg the typhoid Mary of surveillance capitalism. But putting that aside, the lack of women in technology is, I think, leading to the kinds of problems where we aren't detecting the types of issues that Dolores Huerta saw in the fields, right? If we don't have women in these companies at multiple levels in these companies working on a status equal with men, whatever that level may be, we will be missing out. And the diligence that needs to be done becomes more difficult when we don't have the voices of these activists. There are many women activists in the tech sector. I think many of us know Rebecca McKinnon, who's done some really interesting work designing an indicator and ranking for digital rights that doesn't look at gender inequality, right? It looks at privacy and expression. What if we were to have more of these indicators that are under development look specifically through the lens of gender, no matter the issue we're looking at? I think that would be fundamentally feminist and very interesting for us. So activists have progressed our field. They are paving the way for women up the chain. And ultimately what they all have in common, whether they're in agriculture or industrial labor, is demanding respect and demanding access to remedy for labor rights violations when they are wronged. So this is a long conversation. We're on a continuum, and I do think we're moving forward, but businesses can do more if they do sufficient due diligence.
Thank you so much, Erika. I would say that what they have in common, they also have one other thing in common, very important: resilience. Resilience to go on, which is nowadays particularly important to refer to. Very interesting points there. And you mentioned tech, women in tech. This is a very challenging topic. I have the feeling that we are again doing the same mistakes that, well, we did long time ago. We are building a public space, a new public space, digital space, again, without diversity. So we, again, will have indirect discriminations and we'll have people being excluded. And this is very interesting and important to raise a concern, particularly at the level of governments and the ones that are now deciding to have those very challenging programs of digital transition. I can see that through the complaints that we receive, the number of people that are left behind simply because they don't have a mobile, and they have the right not to have the mobile, actually. So because they don't know how to access in the computer, and they have the right to do so and continue to be autonomous and not have to ask the help of a grandchild. And this is really a very important topic. We cannot, again, build a world that with no rights. We are in an era of rights, and we cannot continue the path to have no rights to a certain amount of people. And this comes to you, Salil, I think very well. So Salil, the online space appeared to be a level playing field for women. However, the online space has been hostile to women with misogynistic attacks, online threats, offline violence, all of which have silenced many women. What should companies do or can do as part of their due diligence to make the online space safe for women? That is to ensure that policies in place are gender responsive and bring gender issues to the front.
Yeah, no, it's one of those fascinating questions, right? Because online world created the illusion that we are in an equal space. Anyone can get on social media, prepare a little movie or a video and get it out. And we've been doing some research both at the Institute, and I also have another hat that I wear, which is as the chair of the Writers in Prison Committee at PEN International. So I'm very familiar with women journalists and writers who constantly face attacks online. And there is some brilliant research by Amnesty International about a year or 2 years ago about how women who take public positions, whether as human rights defenders or the kind of women that Erika was speaking about, in the earlier slide, those who are speaking of workers' rights or women's rights, and the kind of vituperative and misogynistic and obscene attacks that they routinely face. I mean, the cases that I have are they really go beyond the norms of any civilized norms that we can think of, where doxing is common, where women are identified where they live and their personal details are made public, and mainly with a view to physically intimidate them. For example, cases where a woman who is a rationalist blogger, so she's non-religious in Bangladesh, and when she was writing about women's rights and atheism, the police said that, why don't you write on topics like flowers and fashion? Why do you write about these things? And now she lives in exile in Scandinavia, so she's able to do what she wants. But that's another example. Another woman in Pakistan called Kandil Baluch, who was identified, docs found out, and her own cousin or brother, someone from her family, actually killed her after that because she brought shame to the family. So the point is that there is a continuum between the online threats, which are not just isolated attacking remarks being made against women, but it's offline manifestation. It's very common. And 3 cases that we knew through our work at Penn, but they're quite well known and they're not restricted to them, because there's also the case of Beata Cacares, the human rights defender, who was threatened online. And then, of course, later she was killed. And Anna Politkovskaya in Russian Federation, Gauri Lankesh in India, and Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta. 3 examples I can immediately think of women who were threatened online first, and then they were physically eliminated. So it's a very, very real problem. And companies typically respond because they simply cannot cope. The amount of volume of materials that is being uploaded online every minute is just enormous, and it's physically not possible to do so. So what companies have to do is the kind of thing that Maina Kiai has been talking about. Maina Kiai is a former Amnesty person. He was a former UN Special Rapporteur on the right for peaceful assembly and association. And now he's a human rights activist in Kenya. He used to be my colleague when I was at Amnesty. And what Maina has said is that, why is it not possible to stagger it? So why is it just as, if you see a television program, and you want to ensure that abusive comments or defamatory comments are not made, so there's a 10-second or a 15-second gap. So you don't do it for every post or every tweet that comes out. But if there is a well-founded fear that this individual is, the internet term is trolling and abusing and trying to drive someone off the internet, is it possible to do something like that? It requires effort. It requires resources. It requires having more people devoted to the task of, in a way, and this is the uncomfortable part, because you are monitoring speech. But the speech you're monitoring is not the free speech, but speech that is going to lead to incitement of violence, which is very different from even hate speech. Hate speech is speech we hate, we disagree with it, so we call it hate speech. That's not what I'm after. I'm not suggesting that there needs to be something to monitor robust debate. Robust debates are necessary. Controversial debates are good for democracy. So that's not the point. But when there's a specific call made for violence against an individual, I was born in India, and I have a friend there called Rana Ayub, who's a very brave journalist. And they have been morphing her imagery and creating deep fake videos of her in extremely unparliamentary ways. I wouldn't want to describe it, but they're very obscene videos put out about her by people who dislike her journalism because she's critical of the Indian government. And there has to be a way to stop that. Deep faking is a very big problem. And there's a third part of online space, which is also where women are being marginalized, and which is the issue of gaming. Now, I don't play video games really, but lots of people do. But when women enter and take on an avatar of a woman superhero, then the kind of vituperative hatred again that they got. And this was a problem that companies like Microsoft and others tried to fix by having better monitoring. So there are ways getting around it. One of the things that Facebook had tried in Myanmar in the context of of the whole Rohingya issue, which wasn't successful, but it was a good attempt, was to replace the hate speech with facts and flower speech, as they called it, by people in the system itself. So there would be volunteers who would be doing it, because it's impossible problem to fix. But I'm a bit of a hardliner here, because if you look at the market capitalization and cash reserve that these companies have, they do have the resources to put into people who understand human rights, who understand gender sensitivity, who are not going to be speech police, but who are going to make sure that the system is wholesome. And there is precedent. All these companies that we talk about have systems in place to ensure that their rules and codes of conduct are not violated. If I start saying completely random things, I will get kicked out of Twitter. I will get kicked out of Facebook. But why is it that when people who do this to women of color, women women who are from sexual minorities, or women who are disabled, why is it that the response time is so slow? So I think the companies have to do a better job of monitoring it. Companies also have to do a much better job of understanding content and not fall for the trap that companies often fall into, which is that there's cultural relativism and this kind of speech is okay in certain contexts and so on. So I think this is going to be a very major problem, just as we wanted. But I'll give you another example. I know of at least 2 writers who have written brilliant books on gender equity, both in Britain. They've gone off social media completely. They only post their announcements on LinkedIn now. They don't put anything that they do either on Twitter or Facebook, because the kind of opposition that they got from people. And one of them is a very good friend of mine, and she just said, so life is too short, it's not worth it. And that makes the world not the kind of inclusive place where ideas are excellent that Google, Facebook, Twitter, all of them claim to adhere to. So it means greater gender sensitivity, better human rights impact assessments, and moving into the granular qualitative intersection studies, which are difficult. And in a way, it gets me into the point Nadia made, and I'll stop with that. But Nadia, you spoke about the checkbox exercise, and lists are important, I don't deny that. But as Teresa responded, and you yourself noted, they cannot be mechanical. They have to get the gray areas and the nuances. It's not good to say that, we spoke to 50 women to come up with a policy on women, but whether you took those suggestions into account and made changes in your policies to ensure that adverse impacts were mitigated, and if not, you put in place remedies, and this was the outcome of that remedy. Now, if that's the kind of framework you put in place, then it is a meaningful tick box exercise. Otherwise, it's like saying that I spoke to 5 defenders and I did exactly what I wanted to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Salil. The internet governance is really a huge challenge. Now also being defied here in Portugal. We just approved a charter for the digital era. And actually within the presidency of the European Commission, we also approved, I don't know if you heard about, the Lisbon Declaration, that is a path for a future possible charter. And this is actually very interesting to discuss, exactly because one of the problems is internet governance, the idea of having companies that certify content, if that is good, if that is bad, also because you have to balance with the freedom of expression and who certifies these same companies. So huge challenges ahead indeed. So let's move on now to Harpreet Kaur. You are a business and human rights expert with over 15 years, I believe, of management and research experience. In your current position at UNDP's Regional Bureau of Asia and the Pacific, you lead a regional project to promote responsible business practices through regional partnerships in Asia. My question to you is, so while many states have made commitments to uphold women's rights, these commitments are often not being translated into business and human rights agenda, as we know. How can governments adequately include gender equality, namely when developing NAPs and regulations? Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa, for the question. And Salil and Nadia sort of started talking about the checklist, and I was going to start with the checklist and the tick box exercise. But let me sort of try and rephrase. I think before what governments should be doing, there are 2 things I believe that the government should not be doing. If they are really serious about including gender equality in whatever, whether the NAP development process or the NAP itself. And I was going to say you do not make it a tick box exercise essentially, but just listening to what Salil and Nadia said, but I think it's and this is really coming from the experience that we have in my current role, where we are providing technical and advisory support to the government, and what we often hear and feel is it's about sprinkling women here and there. So we would talk to these 5 women. Oh, we did one consultation, but we have 2 committee members who are women. So I think this approach where you think that we're going to sprinkle women here and there and then call it a gender inclusive, I think that's the approach that needs to be challenged, and that's the approach that needs to be changed as well. I think the second thing that the governments should not do is to to put all the women in one box. They are not a homogeneous group; it's a heterogeneous group, and when you're developing the national action plans, the governments need to look at the differential realities, but then also that the experience are accounted for and addressed in the laws, in the regulations, and in the policies that the governments are in the process of developing. From there, I'll kind of start in terms of the 2 phases of the NAP, the national plan. One is sort of in the development phase, when governments sort of start developing the national action plans. I mean, everywhere you need to have an interministerial committee, you need to have a drafting committee. The first thing I think that they should do is to make sure that when you have these interministerial committees or the drafting committees, make sure that these committees have adequate representation of women. There are representation from the ministries of women and child development, but then also that you do bring in sort of gender experts while assessment as well as drafting of the national action plan. So I think that's really is important to ensure that there is diversity within the teams who are responsible for developing and implementing the national action plans. The second key thing that must be done is that the NAP should be informed by the baseline assessments. We all have been talking about it, and while government and other stakeholders undertake these baseline assessments, ensure that they look at the gender disaggregated data, and that actually is a really big problem, because if you sort of start looking at the data, and even the governments who are keen to look at the data and who make that effort to go and look for the data, the fact is that there is very little gender disaggregated data. So there's also that lack of data that needs to be addressed. So ensure when you're looking at this kind of information, you bring in information from society organizations and various other institutions where you can bring in that gender disaggregate data, but then also at the same time conduct gender audits, review whether laws, policies, norms, standards, and practices are directly or indirectly discriminating towards women. So I think that's really an important part on the when you're looking at sort of the baseline assessments for developing the national action plans. I think it's also important to look at, and assess how the current and the future omissions might adversely affect women. That's again, one of the key points when we are suggesting or advising governments to ensure that women are not sprinkled, in the processes as well. So once you've looked at these baseline assessment, also make sure that there is ensure there's a meaningful participation of women in the consultations. Again, make sure consultations are held with a wide range representing diverse set of women, and much has been said about intersectionality on this on this webinar today. So do take into account the intersectionality and the different experiences that women have, because that would help you understand the different human rights risks, but then also different ways that you could address them in your policy documents. The NAPs should also account for the existing structural barriers that women face in achieving equality, and therefore should not be gender neutral. The NAPs must be gender responsive, and this whole the idea that we're going to have a gender neutral NAP is never going to bring in equality, because there are systemic and structural barriers that women face, and unless you address that, it's not, and unless you sort of unless you acknowledge and address that, it's not going to be a gender equal world in any ways. The other thing is also about where governments, the governments for each NAP, the government response section should have concrete targets, timelines, indicators, and attribution of responsibility to different government entities. So it's really important that the governments take measures, including affirmative action, to achieve substantive equality forms of discrimination, harassment, and violence against women, and ensure that they engage gender-sensitive experts to evaluate the efficacy of the measurement taken. I think the last really is to ensure that your national action plans address both specific and systemic abuses affecting women, and propose a range of preventive, redressive, and deterrent remedies that could change power structures and reduce violence against women. Thank you.
Now I'm nervous, Harpreet. Very nervous.
And you could come here for advice.
Of the Portuguese nap. No, it's
yeah, but Teresa, there are actually certain good examples. There are actually certain good examples where the national action plans have at least tried to address some of these issues, and we'd be happy to share some of these resources if that's easier.
Harpreet. I will be willing to read them all. But this also allows me to say something that is very important, at least to link the academia with practice, because one thing is to talk about a NAP and to read and to talk about it in theory. The other thing is when we try to put it on paper, and many times what the decision makers feel is lost, absolutely lost, because they're beginning, they're doing their first, now, for example, in Portugal, doing the first draft. And what I do believe it's important is to be realistic. I mean, this is a path, and it's better to have something than not to have anything. And, nowadays we have a lot of peer pressure, international, which is very good, because most of the time states do go on and develop exactly because of this peer pressure. And we're going to hear Olena probably speaking also on this, and this is good. But at the same time, we also have to keep in mind the importance of being realistic, and deliver something that we know that states can comply. You talked about the concrete objectives, timelines, and that also companies can comply. Because what I often hear from companies is saying, well, you are asking us to do something that the state is not able to do. So you're being unrealistic. We need to have means to implement what you ask us to do. So sometimes states do have to balance what, in fact, they can and they can't do, but always keeping in mind, the goal that is to have the best possible national action plan that they can have. And I am there as a national human rights institution, mainly as an observer, and of course, offering expertise whenever I am asked. So Olena, you are Associate Professor of Law, Chair of the International Lab on Business and Human Rights at Yaroslav Mudry National Law University in Ukraine. And since 2021, you also lead the Project and Research Support Center in that same university. I believe you also led the National Baseline Assessment. How can companies be the drivers of positive changes in local contexts where the legislation is not protective of gender equality? Thank you, Olena.
Thank you very much for this webinar and the whole series of webinars. Do you hear me well? Yeah, everything is okay? Yeah, okay. I should actually reflect to your last point about realistic, because yesterday our government, Ukrainian government, adopted the National Action Plan to implement National Strategy for Human Rights. A national strategy was adopted this March, and we were happy because it's the first time when the national strategy has a special chapter on business and human rights, but the national strategy is quite an abstract, general document, and we were waiting for a national action plan. And our government wants to be realistic as well, and that's why our national action plan has just one action to implement the chapter on business and human rights, and this action to study good practices, how to implement UN guiding principles. And actually it was so upset yesterday to see this one point, because we developed a lot, a great list what we can do, but now we have just one. Yeah, but I will be back to your question, and I would say that I hope that companies could be the drivers of positive changes, and it's extremely important to have business on the side of gender equality in societies that have a long tradition of paternalistic regulation, especially if we are talking about Ukraine and other post-Soviet countries, especially in labor relations. And as a key result of such regulation, an employee doesn't act as independent and equal party in such relations. All the conditions of an employee's work are formally determined by the state, and women are considered primarily as an object of protection by the state in connection with the reproductive function and family responsibilities. And as a result, such excessive protection by the state makes them less competitive in the labor market. There is one more reason why readiness of businesses to be such drivers play a crucial role, not just because for gender equality, but for the new social contract in our society as well. And I will explain this point briefly. Last week in Ukraine, we conducted the webinar on good corporate practices, and one of the key conclusions were that we need to understand the local context and to adapt general tools and standards of human rights diligence in particular to the local context. It's not a new conclusion, but it's not our reality still. And one of the biggest Ukrainian business associations said last week that the global companies that come to Ukraine with their human rights policies realize soon that these policies don't work in Ukraine. They are not effective because of many reasons. And from other side, Ukrainian companies, if they try to implement responsible business conduct standards by the translating human rights policies of the Western companies, just taking them as good examples, or just duplicate the human rights due diligence procedure, they have not any success with that. It doesn't work because it was not adapted to the local context, because it doesn't realize in many things, including multi-sectional discriminations issues and so on. And what we should understand about Ukrainian and all other post-Soviet societies in the context of gender equality and business and human rights framework, to my view, it's important to keep two things in mind. The first is that the private business was not an actor of social life for a very long period of time in our society. Private business has emerged in the territory of former USSR only 1991. Up to this moment, private business was banned under the threat of criminal liability. The idea of private property was denied, and all enterprises were state-owned. The economy was centralized and administrated by command methods. And I believe that the key difference of Eastern Europe is due to the fact that business here was not a subject of relations between the state and society for a very long time. It just didn't exist here. And there was no discussion about what is the role of business in society. Business didn't oppose the state if it did wrong things. Society did not address its expectations toward businesses. And the only subject responsible for everything that happens in society, good and or bad, was the state. And we still live in this reality. We don't expect from businesses anything related to human rights. We still expect, all our expectations are related to the state. And today, business claims to be a party of the social contract, to play an active role in determining what is happening in society and to influence the development of society. But if so, it's a very important moment for us, because business must be aware that having influence in society is linked to responsibility for that influence. Labor relations and paternalistic regulations that we have now in labor relations could be a good chance for business to be drivers of such changes, because we still have the Soviet labor code, and it's prohibited, for example, to allow pregnant women and women with children under the age of 3, regardless of their will, to work at night, to work on weekend, to be sent on business trips. For example, if you have children under the 3 years, you cannot go to business trip. It's absolutely prohibited. And many other things still operate in our legislation. And business could apply international standards on gender equality, but it should deny to apply national legislation, and it required to be quite proactive for this point. Yes, it's simple to say that international standards should have priority, but we understand that it's hard to realize. So in this way, I think that business really has good chance to be such drivers of positive changes for our society.
Thank you very much, Olena, particularly for all your work and your resilience, for sure. So Erika, continuing again on the NAPs and setting the scene, how can we identify the indicators that give relevant information about gender equality? Because we heard that it's very important to have concrete measures, identify concrete measures in these NAPs in order, of course, to be monitored. But how can we identify the indicators? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share screen again, just to again show images of some things I'm excited about as opportunities. So as countries are constructing their NAPs, I think it's important to determine what kind of information will be collected and how that information will be used. I'm very encouraged about the World Benchmarking Alliance's new to be launched later this month, gender equality and empowerment benchmark. We've talked about check boxes and the efficacy of that, but I do think having some sort of standard against which businesses will be measured on these grounds will be important. It'll give them something to strive for, and it will also give the other private industry and private sector agents a way to enforce. So we're seeing more activity on the part of shareholders to ask different questions and to be interested in investing in human rights or investing the rights way, as more and more retail investors, at least in the United States, and I think frankly even more so in Europe, are concerned about the conditions under which products are produced. So what the benchmark will be doing, and I've been impressed with what I've seen of the model, is taking a more holistic approach. So a lot of sustainable development goals, before that the Millennium Development Goals, were purely quantitative. I think whenever we are talking about the kind of information we need with respect to gender equality and gender empowerment, we also need a qualitative understanding of what the challenges are. So it's not enough to say that X number of women are CEOs. What are the cultures in those places that stymie further growth and development and true equality? So what this benchmark is doing is bringing everything together, or purports that it will, and if it is able to do this, I think it'll be very successful. It's integrated, holistic, and also balanced. So integrated in the sense that it seeks to identify gaps, doing that by looking to those who have the information, and it's also going to be flexible and industry specific. Trying to see how an easy example I can give of this. So for example, the scope of the methodology looks to understanding different stakeholder groups, the workplace, the marketplace, the supply chain, and the community. And then that's balanced against indicators that would be familiar to us with kind of softer things like influence in a particular place. It'll look to hard numbers for compensation and promotion and recruitment, but it also looks to things like agency. How this will be measured, I am not sure, but it is a right direction to be looking. Do women have agency when they are in these places and spaces? So understanding that will be important as we're crafting maps.
Thank you. And now just going back to Olena, you somehow touched this question, but specifically, I mean, it is very clear that companies can use their leverage to change cultures. So how, in your opinion, can companies contribute to change general culture related to gender equality? For example, it's not very fair that I do this to you after you gave us the framework, but I take a question that was done in the Q&A. How important is the role of companies and governments supporting more fathers to take parental leave in this discussion? In many societies, it is still not accepted that men half of the parental leave or work part-time, but if women would not have to carry the whole burden of care work, they might become more competitive in the labor market. So to you, Olena.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, of course, the legislation is important to solve this issue that you said about fathers and their role. And actually, Ukraine has adopted the new law that gives fathers the right to have 2 weeks after the child birth. But again, the whole presumption is that the responsibility to care about the child, of course, it's should be on mother, and so the general rule is the same. But actually, this law was a great victory of civil society organizations that work on gender equality in Ukraine, and yeah, it's a good step, but it's absolutely not enough, and we need to monitor our legislation first of all, but we could not wait when the state will do all things that should do, yeah, and that's why, as I said before, it would be a great opportunity for us if companies will show good examples, because our legislation doesn't restrict them to implement good practices, yeah, so they could do it, and yeah. And actually, I should say that cooperation is significant, is crucial moment, I think, especially again for our society, because we have not a long tradition to respect human rights, and actually civil society organizations in our societies key players who actually aware on human rights, who have experience how to protect human rights, how to monitor human rights, and in particular how to monitor gender equality. And that's why I think that a good chance again for businesses in our society is to cooperate with civil society organizations, just because they have this expertise. And we, for example, developed last year the study about corporate responsibility to respect internal displacement women in Ukraine in the situation of conflict that is going on our territory. And it was a huge challenge even for the team who was represented by academia, by civil society experts. So how businesses could do it itself, and the businesses doesn't have such experience on human rights and gender equality, and so on and so forth, and especially if we are talking about small and medium enterprises that have not resources, human resources, financial resources to do such researches, to do such procedures. So I think that it should be in cooperation with civil society and with academia.
Thank you, Olena. I will turn to Harpreet, actually, because not only if you want to add, because you probably have important things that you can add on the question of parental leave, since several gender guidance designed for companies are being developed. So the question is, how can they provide practical guidance to companies, including gender responsive assessment, gender transformative measures, or gender transformative remedies? Harpreet.
Thanks, Teresa. Just adding on to what Olena said and the question on parental leave, I've actually had a lot of experience in my previous positions, where I was working with the companies, particularly on maternity and childcare, where a lot of companies, and this was essentially my work in India, where a lot of companies were interested, and they were really worried about this, what Salil mentioned as the pipeline, sort of the shrinking pipeline to leadership. And one of the reasons that was identified, or the research that said that around 50% of women were leaving out of the workforce during the period of maternity and childcare. This was essentially happening largely during the first 6 months of the child born. And large part of it is about the childcare responsibilities. And I think it was around in 2017-18 when the government of India actually extended the maternity leave to 6 months instead of 3 months, which was the original. Originally was 3 months leave. And there were, in some ways we thought that it's a victory, where you've had now an extended maternity leave, women don't have to really worry about it, they can continue with childcare responsibilities. But in some ways it kind of took away, it kind of put more responsibilities on women. Now you have maternity leave, which is now 6 months. So all that your childcare responsibility is here. There is paternity leave, but the paternity leave was only for about 2 weeks. And again, research and data indicates that while men took this leave, they did not change the nappies. They would not sort of spend the nights up and sort of taking care of the child, because that was not considered cool to do, because that's how the social and cultural norms or the gender norms were existent or are still existent in the country. So I think a lot of these companies do invest on training women so that they can manage the period during maternity and childcare, and they don't feel anxious and they don't leave workforce. But actually, there are no, at least I don't know of any awareness sessions or any trainings that are being organized so that men also understand the responsibilities or the changes that are happening, and then they become equal partners in providing childcare. And I think that's where companies, the coaching is happening only for women, the mentoring is happening only for women. And this was the time when I was leading a center for women's leadership, and I think I would often ask this question: I actually haven't come across any center that's say a center for men's leadership. All the centers around the world are center for women's leadership, as if only women need training in there. So I think there is a lot of there is a lot of pressure on women to to prove themselves, to get better and all of it. But I think the socio-cultural norms kind of provide a deterrent in that space where where men are not made aware and made sensitive about about the approaches that they need to have. So I think that's where companies also do need to sort of start engaging men in the conversation, not just keep on training women in the space to do better in life. I think that's just sort of in terms of adding on to the child care responsibilities. Coming back to your question on the guidance, we've now seen that there are various tools and guidance that are being provided to provide practical guidance to companies on how to implement the UN guiding principles and sort of, ensure that. And in some ways, these tools and guidance, have helped improve our understanding of gender by fully considering the intersectional nature of discrimination, the systemic and socio-cultural issues, and thus also have helped us identifying this overlapping vulnerabilities, and I think help pay companies pay attention to the fact that different groups of women may be impacted differently by different corporate activities and therefore require different practices to address those issues. Again, these tools and guidances have helped us understand and have enhanced the due diligence processes by engaging and consulting with women and women's organizations as well as gender experts throughout the process to ensure sort of both short-term practical needs as well as strategic interests of women are addressed. Again, there are different tools and guidances that are available. Of course, the key one is the gender guidance that was developed by the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, which provides step-by-step guidance. But I think what also it does, it provides you those illustrative examples to both states and businesses to integrate gender dimensions. Again, I think it provides the framework that posits that gender should be a cross-cutting issue at all stages of due diligence and access to remedy, and look at sort of gender-sensitive assessments to the implementation of gender transformative measures and remedies. One of another really good tool that I've come across is the BSR's making women workers count. I think it's a framework for conducting gender responsive due diligence in supply chains. And it provides recommendations on 4 phases of due diligence. But I think what I like about that tool is that it provides a set of indicators that can be used to measure outcomes for women and men workers, as well as methodologies for collecting and analyzing gender data. And I think that's there are very few tools that are kind of be able to sort of look at indicators and provide gender disaggregated data as well. The other thing, another really good tool that I've come across, and I think Liz mentioned in the chat, as well as this women rights due diligence toolkit that was developed by Geneva Institute, and I think that's a really good tool to sort of start looking at how do you conduct women's rights due diligence. Just lastly, we have also been sort of looking at, we have at the UNDP, we've been working to develop a casebook, which is sort of, the idea really is, to provide cases from Asia Pacific, and Salil has been helping us, in researching on that. And this is a casebook that we're developing where, and what we've done is we've brought, we're trying to bring together the cases where companies have faced challenges and dilemmas, sometimes due to their own actions, but then also sometimes due to the societies that they operate in, and therefore where inequities are formidable. So I think the casebook is through this casebook we're not sort of trying to praise or condemn any particular company or sort of country or the practices, but I think it's really we hope that this is a casebook that become as a learning tool for learning for other companies who may operate in similar circumstances. So I think there are these tools available. It's about how do you operationalize them, and I think more importantly again use them in your context, regional context, your socio-cultural context as well. So yeah, thanks, Teresa.
I thank you, Harpreet. for answering both questions, adding on the parental leave. So we are reaching the end, actually reaching the part of the Q&A. So I have to say again to the audience, if you want to pose any questions to these brilliant panelists, please do so in the Q&A. For now, I have here a question of Monique. I believe that the other question was somehow already answered, but I would like to know, how is it possible to overcome networking bias and to include more women? So again, on the company side, if anyone cared to answer, please do so. Maybe Salil, Penelope, if you want to answer this on this. Penelope, do you want to answer? Or do you think that we can overcome the network bias and to include more women?
I think
oh yes,
I
yes.
might suggest that if it's incentivized for leadership to mentor junior scholars, junior staff, junior executives, the incentive structures have to be aligned in such a way that those who would be inclined but not make the time or have the time for it, make it a priority. So you know, in the neoliberal system that we have, if there are ways to reward people, either in currency or some other kind of currency, I think that will start to see a shift. The other thing is women do a really good job lifting up other women. So finding those communities within your area, your field, networking among women actually gets more women further. And I think there's been research on this. I'll try to find and put in the chat. But getting people to overcome bias first means you have to identify the bias. And a lot of people have unconscious bias or biases that they're not willing to admit to. So creating enough of a culture of psychological safety where people can admit what it is they don't know, and then encourage them to get to know more about women and gender equity and gender empowerment and bring them on board.
Erika, Olena.
Yeah, I actually totally agree with Erika, and I think it would be just to propose them to read more and to know more about the impact of a positive impact of diversity on the company operating. So there are many books about it. So yeah, just to train. Just to understand that they create these barriers to develop own company.
Yes,
if I could.
Yes,
sorry, Teresa, if I could just add on this networking, you know, what are the reasons why women are not able to network, or, you know, can attend those trainings, or, you know, can go on these on-site trainings or activities? I think one of the key reasons is the child care, you know, is the care work, right? And, you know, and this is again from my previous experience, you know, where we wanted women to come and join these trainings. And the only difference that we did, you know, the only different approach that we took was, when we invited these women for the training, and this was actually for both men and women, we organized the training at a place where there was also a daycare. So, you know, women could bring their children to the, you know, while they were at the training, they, you know, they had a daycare where the children were taken care of. So, you know, they didn't have to take the favor from the men and the family, you know, to take care of the child, because they have to now go for a training. And I think that really encouraged women to come and join these, you know, trainings, you know, the networking events. And I think that really kind of, you know, that was one small thing, but it did. But we saw, you know, many women turned up for that one when we provided that. You know, that small change in the way that we were looking at networking. And I think the other thing is about role models. You know, how many role models do we really see? And, you know, and therefore the value of coaching and mentoring. And I think Erika also said, you know, in terms of you know, that women lift other women. So I think the importance of role models, coaching, mentoring. Some companies have now started with this buddy program where they, you know, where they have younger women, you know, kind of work closely with more senior women in the organization, and that kind of help, you know, seeing on a day-to-day life, you know, in terms of shadowing these senior women and showing, you know, how they have done this. And I think it's just more important to show that 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 you could have children and you could have a normal life and you could succeed in your work and can have a career, not just a job, where you have aspiration to sort of move up in the pipeline to leadership.
I just want to add, I don't know, is it just in our culture, but many times women were saying that, for example, men could go to the bar or more private places and to discuss some business issues, and women just cannot go with them, and it's an element of networking as well. So, but I don't know how to combat this culture.
Yeah, I wouldn't advise women to start smoking and drinking just because you want into get those circles. But we all know, a lot of these conversations and a lot of decisions do take place in these, in these offside smoke breaks. And I'm sure, all of us have been, have seen the impact one or another time in our life. I certainly have, being a non-smoker.
Yes, Harpreet, in Portugal,
encouraged me to start smoking for sure.
Yeah, in Portugal, you have to speak about football as well. Okay, so maybe drink, smoke, not so much smoke, drink. Yeah, we have excellent wine, and you have to speak, and you have to know about football, which sometimes is a problem, as you can imagine. But it's so interesting what we're talking about, because it's actually changing business culture, and it's absolutely true. Women have such an important role model. Namely, I have another example. I was hearing you all talking about, dynamics, meeting dynamics. And I don't know if you noticed, but normally what I notice is that I have, a number of people, I ask a question, and I can even have a balanced number of people in this meeting. And normally only men speak, or normally men are raising their hands and are giving comments. And most of the times women do not do that, unless, and that's what that when I ask, they say, if they have something to really add on in the discussion. And the thing is, and I'm constantly, even in academia, when I teach or I give lectures on this, you have to speak. You have to speak. This is important to speak. Or within business models, if I have the chance to speak with, CEOs, they have to know how to reach women if they really understand that most of the times women are less vocal than men in their organizations. So in the end, I do believe it's very much awareness, and we have to work a lot on awareness at all levels. Society, of course, academia plays a very important role, companies in particular. So now, Salil and Nadia, maybe Salil, can you go on?
No, I just wanted to echo the point you made, Teresa, how important it is, in meetings that are run, where it is, you're absolutely right, that men tend to, dominate the space and so on. And I read this, and I'm sure all of you have read, and I'm sure all the panelists also know about it, but I just thought I'll mention that there was this tactic that people had spoken about, that when a woman does raise an interesting point, very often the man next to her takes it over as if it was his idea. And the way to avoid that is for other women to keep speaking up on the point and keep reminding everybody that the idea actually came from her and not from him. And I think that's very important for people who run the meetings, and very often they tend to be men, to actively seek out women at the beginning rather than towards the end as an additional point. But these are very minor things, but they very subtly tend to change the culture. One thing I do, for example, when I constitute a panel for the institute or at Penn, is that I begin by listing the women I want on the panel, and then to fill the gaps, I look for men if they are needed. So in a way, inverting the process. And I remember once we had a conference of the Institute here in New York about 5 years ago, and we had 18 panelists over 5 sessions, and out of the 18, 16 were women. So, and these were about, things like China and technology. They were not quote unquote feminine or feminist issues. And somebody did come and say, I noticed there were a lot of women. So I, with a very straight face, said, we tried very hard to find competent men, but it was so difficult.
Nadia.
And just to add very quickly, I think we're on anecdotes now, but I think in a way it's also telling, and it's the end of the day. So First of all, I want to say that Erika is extremely good at doing this thing of repeating the point that was just made and just adding to it. So I can see from looking at you when Salil was saying that it actually is a strategy of yours, which I'm definitely going to steal. But more about the networking element, and also the sort of avoiding the sort of drinking culture after work and decisions being made there. One thing that I think would be relatively easy for organizations to put in place is to have sort of lunch networks or breakfast networks at times that are working times, rather than do that outside of regular working hours, which is discriminating for people who have care responsibilities, and often those are gendered. The other thing I wanted to say is about networking and my experience of this year and a half of going on webinars and online meetings, that of course this is a short event, so it wouldn't apply, but it's a plea in a way for organizers to have sort of breakout rooms at breaks where people, and especially early career researchers, can join. Because for someone like me with already a network, you know, at break, I just talk to the people I know, and I'm so happy to see them. And it's of course wonderful to see so many faces that people I know today. But I'm also thinking about people who are just starting their career, who don't have that network, who don't know people that well, and for whom this is really having a huge impact, not only on, you know, how good they feel about themselves, but also potentially on their careers, as so many of those, oh, I have a project on that, happen at the coffee breaks. So it's also a plea for organizers to have those breakout rooms and to allow early career researchers to also join those conversations. And I know it's not easy, but perhaps it's easier than in real life. So, you know, please do it. And it's always welcome. That's speaking for myself here, but really look forward to going back to real life for that. But also, I think we can use online meetings to also engage perhaps in a way that we would not have been able to engage if this pandemic hadn't happened. So, yeah, please reach out.
Thank you, Nadia. So I see the ends of Penelope and Erika. Just before, I have here a question of Dusu, and Dusu, I'm sorry, I just read it now. So Dusu has a question to the panel. What type of concrete, realistic and intersectional policies can governments and corporations adopt? So Penelope, we don't hear from you. Can you, do you have internet connection? Okay.
I do. Yeah, I'm okay right now. So hopefully it won't. I've been having an unstable internet for those of you attending. So what kinds of concrete? Well, I think, you know, I think one of the things, and this is a very general thing, is that we have to try and imagine the world differently. I think it's really important that we don't just, if we want to avoid kind of this, you know, adding women and other groups, you know, racialized people, et cetera, and stirring to different types of initiatives and regulations, we have to sort of try and think about the world differently, not just take what we have. I was at a really interesting conference the other day where they had a map of the world that was, you know, upside down, where they had the global south at the top and the global north at the bottom. And I think, you know, this kind of reorienting our thinking around, you know, who are the rights holders and who are the people that we need to kind of reach and address, and not just think about, oh yes, you know, we're going to just add a few things here and there. So that's one thing. So then it's a very general thing. I was actually going to say something about companies changing their culture, if I can just add a point on that. I think companies should, first of all, talk to the women in their organization about what they see as the problem, engage with them, consult with them, but also perhaps bring in some experts who could help them to think about some of the different structures within the organization that are, sort of continuing the structural discrimination of society within the organization. I think that would be important.
You no longer have your end up. Yeah, thank you very much, Penelope. Allow me just to add something of my own experience in my former life as a politician. Women do not have to change to adapt to environments. They should not change. They should be aware of the difference of that environment and the fact that you have this motor that tries to make everyone exactly the same, and the same is a masculine norm. And I remember being called to attention to change sometimes the way I would speak. It was too feminine, too soft, the idea of being too soft. And I've always taken this example to me, and I whenever I can, I explain, especially to students or to whom I'm talking to, because, well, it takes courage to be different. But if you really want to change the world, you have to bear that responsibility. And well, I will for now stop and give the floor to Claire, just saying that, well, I heard once the special rapporteur, I believe it was on the right to privacy, saying something that I take with me wherever I go. Let us not stop until the good is better and the better is best. And I believe this is a wonderful phrase when it comes to this path of, well, the future that we want, and that we want to be part of it as agents of change. Thank you very much, everyone. It was actually a true privilege to be with you. Claire.
Thank you very much, Teresa. I'll just be very brief. I wanted to give a very warm thank you to all our panelists. We've had a very exciting and wonderful panel today from 3 continents, which also meant very different time zones. And some of us, like Erika, had to get up very late. Others, like Harpreet, had to stay up very late. And I'm very grateful to all of you for having taken the time to be here with us. And I also wanted to extend my gratitude to Teresa, who has not only been a fantastic chair today, but also a real support throughout this webinar series on business, human rights and the environment in Europe. So thank you to all. This was the last episode of our series, but stay tuned for the next events in the autumn term. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.